All right, welcome to the deep dive.
Mm.
Today, we're going to be taking on a real classic puzzle. It's one of those things that's been around forever in philosophy, but is also very much a live question in science.
Yeah.
We're talking about the whole nature versus nurture thing, what's built in, what's learned, innate versus acquired, all that.
It's a question that really cuts to the core of, well, how we understand ourselves in the natural world.
Right, exactly. And I think it's really interesting how even today, it's Darwin's theory of evolution that really shapes how we even think about this question.
Oh, absolutely. Darwin's work is really the backdrop for pretty much any modern discussion of innate behavior.
Okay, so let's rewind a bit. Before Darwin came along and, kind of shook things up with his evolutionary ideas, what were the main ways people thought about where, complex behaviors come from?
Well, one really important perspective before Darwin was this idea of what was called natural theology.
Oh,
So you had thinkers like William Paley and William Kirby, and they were looking at all these incredible behaviors in animals, right? Like you think about birds migrating thousands of miles, or a spider building this intricate web, or the very specific ways animals court each other.
yeah, pretty amazing stuff.
And they saw this as undeniable proof of a divine creator. Paley, for instance, defined instinct as, basically a tendency to behave in a certain way that exists before any learning or experience. It seemed like these behaviors were just so perfect right from the start that they couldn't possibly be the result of just trial and error or
Yep.
learning, right?
Yeah, like they were just kind of pre-programmed.
Exactly. Kirby, he went even further, saying that these instincts were basically God's way of animating the natural world. He even said that without these divinely implanted instincts, the whole animal kingdom would just fall apart.
Wow. Okay, so really different from this idea of gradual evolution, right? So then Darwin comes along and kind of changes the game. How did his ideas challenge this whole view of God just putting these instincts into animals?
Darwin offered this totally natural explanation. He argued that instincts, just like our physical traits, they evolve slowly over time as species adapt to their specific environment. And he drew on all sorts of observations, everything from what animal breeders were doing to his own studies to show that instincts aren't just fixed. They can actually change as the environment changes.
Okay.
Natural selection was a key part of his theory, of course. So variations in instinctive behaviors that give an animal a better chance of surviving or of reproducing those are going to be more likely to get passed on.
Survival of the fittest and all that.
Exactly. But, and here's where it gets really interesting, Darwin also considered this idea of inherited habits. He suggested that actions that were, at first done consciously and kind of intelligently could, through repetition, become more and more automatic and eventually maybe even be inherited.
So something you learn could eventually become an instinct. That's kind of wild.
Yeah, it's a bit of a Lamarckian idea, this inheritance of acquired traits, and it's still something people debate about Darwin's work. But the point is that for him, the line between instinct and learned behavior was, it could get pretty blurry over evolutionary time.
So it wasn't just, totally separate categories, instincts versus learning. There was some potential for overlap.
Right, exactly.
Okay, so we've got Darwin shaking things up. Now, what about Alfred Russel Wallace? He was, the co-discoverer of natural selection. Right?
Yeah, that's right.
Did he agree with Darwin on all this, especially when it came to the human mind?
Wallace was definitely key in developing natural selection, but he had some pretty big disagreements with Darwin, especially about how it applied to, human mental abilities. He wasn't convinced that natural selection could explain everything about the human mind.
Okay, what specifically? What was he skeptical about?
Well, he questioned, for example, how something like basic musical ability in early humans,
Right.
how could that have really helped them survive, enough for it to be selected for?
Yeah, I guess it's not fighting off predators or finding food.
Exactly. So unless Darwin could show a really clear benefit of these kinds of traits in the struggle for life, as they called it, Wallace thought there had to be some other force at work in the development of these, uniquely human capacities.
So it was really a question of how much could natural selection explain, especially in humans? Did Wallace have his own ideas about instincts both in animals and in us?
Oh, definitely. He was a strong believer that a lot of what we call instinct in humans was actually learned behavior.
Mm.
And he even extended that to animals, questioning whether something like a bird building a nest was really purely instinctive.
Interesting.
For Wallace, a real instinct had to involve innate knowledge of a very definite kind. So knowledge that's there without any teaching or personal experience. And, he did say that animals inherit general cognitive abilities like basic reasoning and imitation, but he didn't consider those to be instincts. He said these learning abilities were just part of the organization of the nervous system, and they were a more plausible explanation for most animal and human behaviors, rather than, Darwin's emphasis on inherited instincts.
So it sounds like their big difference was about how much of our behavior is like hardwired from the start versus how much comes from our experiences.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it.
Now let's jump ahead to, say, the early 1900s. There's this huge surge of interest in studying instincts. How did Darwin's work influence that?
Well, despite Wallace's, doubts, Darwin's influence was just massive. So in the late 1800s and early 1900s, you see this explosion of research on instincts, largely driven by this idea that, hey, we can study behavior the same way we study anatomy through this lens of evolution.
Right.
But this period is also like full of intense debates about what an instinct actually is and how it interacts with learning, as an organism develops.
Right.
And a key figure here is William James. In his book, Principles of Psychology, he famously suggested that humans actually have a ton of instincts.
Really? A ton?
Yeah, a lot more than people thought. And he included things like hunting, acquiring property, even cleanliness as instincts.
Some of those sound, I don't know, less like these hardwired behaviors and more like things that are shaped by culture or something. What was James's logic there? Why such a broad definition?
The key for James was the role instinct plays in getting behavior started. So he thought many instincts were kind of like implanted in us to eventually give rise to habits. Once those habits are formed through experience and learning, the original instinct, like as an instinct, would often fade away. So it served its purpose developmentally.
Interesting. So it's like instincts were a starting point for learning.
Exactly. So for James, saying a behavior is instinctive meant it had this basic unlearned origin in early development, but it was then shaped and modified by reason and habit as you grow.
Okay, I get it. So it wasn't this like fixed, unchangeable thing. It was more dynamic.
Right. And this contrasts with people like George Romanes, who tended to see instincts as, much more fixed and less influenced by experience throughout an animal's life. So the core difference was whether you saw instincts as the beginning of learning or as these set-in-stone behavioral programs.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, in terms of how these instincts actually arise and get passed down, what was the thinking on the evolutionary mechanisms at play?
Well, the dominant view at the time, especially for people like Romanes and many others,
Right.
was this idea of the inheritance of acquired characteristics. They basically assumed that heredity and environment were super intertwined. You couldn't easily separate them.
Right.
So they thought changes that happened to an organism during its life because of the environment could somehow be passed down to its offspring.
Okay, but wasn't there some pushback against that idea?
Oh, yeah, big time. A guy named August Weismann really challenged this. He proposed this very strict separation between what he called the germplasm, which is the hereditary material, and the soma, which is everything else, the body.
So Weismann's basically saying that changes to your body don't change your genes.
Right.
Right, that would rule out inheriting things like learned habits in that Lamarckian way.
Exactly. Weismann argued that the germplasm is like set aside early on in development, and it's protected from any changes happening in the somatic cells during an organism's life. So that includes learned habits or any acquired traits. He said that natural selection could only work on traits that came directly from the germline. Of course, he knew the environment was important for how an organism develops and expresses its traits, but he insisted that these acquired traits could never become like true adaptations in an evolutionary sense. This idea, the strict separation between what's hereditary, what's governed by the germline and subject to natural selection, and what's acquired, from the environment acting on the body, it became very influential.
It sounds like Weismann is drawing a pretty hard line in the sand there. But weren't some scientists pushing back against this separation of nature and nurture?
Oh, absolutely. And it's kind of ironic that Weismann's ideas gained traction just when a lot of behavioral scientists like James, Conry Lloyd Morgan, Henry Fairfield Osborn, and James Mark Baldwin were developing theories that really emphasized the complex interplay between learning and heredity. They were interested in both individual development and evolution.
Right.
And while they generally agreed with Weismann that you couldn't just directly inherit acquired characteristics as instincts, they did explore ways that learned behaviors could, like, indirectly influence evolution. And this could eventually lead to the evolution of, what look like innate predispositions. These ideas are often grouped together under the Baldwin effect. So these mechanisms basically suggested that learned behaviors could actually shape the selection pressures acting on a population. And this could end up favoring individuals who were genetically predisposed to learn those behaviors more easily. So while inheriting specific habits directly was out, the interaction between learning and evolution was still a big focus.
So it sounds like even as scientists were really getting into studying instincts, the definition of instinct itself was still kind of up in the air.
Totally. In fact, by 1895, Lloyd Morgan himself had listed at least 7 different ways that people were using the word instinct.
7. Wow.
Yeah, and it really shows how a concept that was driving so much research was still super ill-defined. Morgan pointed out contradictions like, were instincts conscious or unconscious, voluntary or involuntary, caused by one thing or many? Do humans have more or fewer instincts than other animals? These were all open questions, and this lack of a clear, shared understanding was a major problem for the field.
So even with this, like, lack of clarity about what an instinct even was, the interest in them just kept going in the early 20th century. What kept that going?
Well, even with the criticisms, the early 1900s just saw this explosion of interest in instincts, and a lot of researchers followed James's lead in proposing these huge lists of human and animal instincts, though often without his focus on how malleable they could be. And these lists varied wildly, some saying there were just a handful of basic human instincts, while others proposed over 100. It really shows how much conceptual chaos there was.
So real disagreement about what counted as an instinct.
Yeah, absolutely. And then comes William McDougall, who was trying to bring some order to this whole mess with his book, Introduction to Social Psychology.
Okay. And what did McDougall say about instincts? What was his take?
McDougall criticized everyone else for being so sloppy with terms like instinct and instinctive. He said an instinct is not just any behavior that appears automatically. For him, instincts were all about motivation, or what he called hormic drives.
Hormic drives.
Yeah, it's a bit of an old-fashioned term, but basically he meant internal drives that push us to act in certain ways. He defined instinct as an inherited or innate psychophysical disposition that makes an organism pay attention to certain kinds of things, experience a specific emotion when it perceives those things, and then act in a particular way, or at least feel like acting that way.
Okay, that's starting to sound a bit more specific.
Right. And importantly, like James, McDougall also recognized that both what triggers an instinct and how it's expressed behaviorally could be changed by learning. So again, we see this attempt to bridge the gap between innate predispositions and the role of experience.
So McDougall's trying to give a more nuanced definition.
Yeah.
But did this put an end to the critiques of instinct theory?
Not quite. In the 1920s, you start to see this real backlash against the whole field of instinct psychology. And people like Knight Dunlap, Luther Lee Bernard, and Xing Ku were leading the charge.
What were their main arguments against instinct theory?
Dunlap was concerned about what he called teleological thinking. This is where you group behaviors together based on what they seem to be for, a fighting instinct, and then you treat them as if they're, naturally fixed.
Right.
And Dunlap argued that this ignores all the complexity of how those behaviors actually develop.
It's like assuming every fight has the same cause.
Exactly. Bernard also pointed out the huge amount of confusion around the word instinct. He said researchers were often mistaking automatic behavior for inherited behavior.
Right, so just because something happens automatically doesn't mean it's in your genes.
Exactly. And they weren't really investigating the genetic basis or considering the role of learning and culture.
So it was more like sloppy science than anything else.
Yeah, a lot of it was. And then you have Kuo, who is probably the most extreme in his rejection of instinct.
Yeah, I've heard he was pretty radical.
He was a huge advocate for behaviorism, and he saw instinct theory as this big obstacle to understanding learning. He said that the very idea of instinct made researchers ignore the crucial environmental factors that shape even very early behaviors. He argued that to actually prove a behavior is hereditary, you'd need to show a fixed pattern, the specific neural mechanisms involved, and a direct link to the germ cells.
Wow, that's a pretty high bar.
Yeah, it is. And Kua eventually questioned this whole distinction between heredity and acquired traits, saying it was basically an unprovable abstraction. He urged psychologists to ditch the label instinctive altogether and just focus on really detailed analysis of how behaviors develop, starting all the way back in the embryo. He famously asked, "How are our instincts acquired?" So he wanted to completely flip the question on its head.
It sounds like those critiques really hit instinct theory hard. So that contributed to its decline in North America, with behaviorism taking over.
Right, but over in Europe, you get this revival of the idea of instinct through ethology.
Right, with people like Lorenz and Tinbergen, if I remember correctly. How did they bring back this idea of instinct?
Ethology was really rooted in Darwinian principles. They saw an animal's behavior as an evolved characteristic, just like, its physical features. They proposed that innate behavior was made up of these identifiable units specific to each species called fixed action patterns.
Fixed action patterns.
And they believed these were mostly determined by genes and triggered by certain stimuli in the environment.
Okay.
A big part of their research involved these things called deprivation experiments. We talked about those earlier.
Right, where you raise an animal in isolation to see if certain behaviors still show up.
Exactly. Their logic was that if an animal that's never had a chance to learn a certain behavior still does it when given the right trigger, then that's strong evidence that the behavior is innate.
Like, it's built in, not learned.
Right.
The,
The classic example is the gosling, the baby goose. It imprints on the first moving object it sees after hatching, even if it's not its mom. The idea was that this imprinting response is just pre-programmed.
Fascinating. But this ethological view of instinct, it ran into some of its own criticisms, right? Especially from those behaviorists in North America.
Oh, yeah, definitely. And the most influential critic was a guy named Daniel Lehrman. He argued that even behaviors that look really species typical and that appear in isolation, they're not necessarily purely innate. He said that even in a controlled deprivation experiment, the animal is still developing in some kind of environment, right? And that environment, even if it seems really limited, could still be playing a big role in how the behavior develops. Lehrman's point was that development always involves an interaction between the organism and its environment from the very beginning.
Okay, so even in those isolation experiments, there's still some environment, some kind of input.
Right. He said deprivation experiments only tell you that the specific things you controlled for weren't necessary for the behavior, not that the behavior developed without any influence from the environment at all.
So Lehrman's really pushing back against this clean separation of innate and acquired, saying it's all about this constant interplay between nature and nurture.
Exactly. He really emphasized the dynamic nature of development. And what's interesting is that his critiques actually had a big impact on ethology itself. Even Tinbergen, one of the founders, he later admitted that innate was a limited term and that we need more nuanced ways of thinking about these things.
So how did the field shift?
The focus moved away from just identifying these fixed action patterns and more towards understanding how behaviors are adaptive in specific ecological contexts. And this led to the field of behavioral ecology. The question became less about whether something was purely innate and more about how it develops and how it contributes to survival and reproduction in a particular environment.
So less black and white, more about the details.
Right.
Now, what about Lorenz? He was, one of the big names in ethology. How did he respond to all this?
Lorenz kind of refined his view of what innate meant. He argued that, okay, maybe no trait is entirely innate, but the information behind its adaptiveness, that could be. He said a trait is innate to the extent that its development is guided by inherited information. This is information about the environment that's built up through natural selection over many generations and encoded in the genes. And he contrasted this with environmental information, which is what an organism learns during its life.
Okay, so two types of information.
Yeah. He used this great example of calluses to illustrate this. So, calluses you get on your hands, those tell the story of, where your skin has been rubbed and stuff. But the calluses on an ostrich's legs, for example, those are there from birth. And Lorenz said those suggest a kind of pre-programmed knowledge encoded in its genes because of, the evolutionary pressures on ostriches.
Interesting. So it's less about the behavior itself and more about, where the instructions for that behavior are coming from.
Exactly. He shifted the focus to the source of the information that's driving the trait's fit with the environment.
That's a really interesting way to think about it. And this idea of inherited information guiding development, it takes us to some of the more modern discussions,
Yeah.
especially in language acquisition with, Chomsky's work.
Right. After behaviorism started to lose its grip, there was growing evidence that different species, they have these specific biological predispositions that affect how they interact with the world and what they can learn. And Chomsky's critique of how behaviorists explained language development, that was a major turning point.
His famous poverty of the stimulus argument.
Exactly. He basically said that the language kids hear just isn't rich enough or consistent enough for them to learn all these super complex grammar rules that they master so quickly and easily when they're young.
Right. Like kids are learning grammar rules they've never explicitly been taught.
Right. So Chomsky's argument was that kids must come with some innate understanding of the basic structure of language, right? Like a starting point.
Right. Okay. And that led to the whole idea of the language acquisition device, right? This hypothetical built-in mechanism specifically for learning language.
Right. And the language acquisition device really became this model for thinking about whether other mental abilities might be innate too. It suggested that, just like language, other aspects of the human mind might develop based on these pre-existing mechanisms that evolved to guide learning in specific areas.
Like dedicated mental modules for different tasks.
Yeah, kind of like that. And then you have developmental psychologists like Susan Carey and Elizabeth Spelk. They propose that we have these innate core knowledge domains, like how we understand objects, agents, numbers, and space.
Okay.
They said that babies actually come with foundational knowledge or theories about these things that shape how they learn and develop.
So not just a blank slate.
Nope, not at all. And even the way that young kids reason about living things versus non-living things, that's also been suggested to stem from some innate predisposition. So this whole neo-nativist perspective, which is heavily influenced by Chomsky, has become really central to how philosophers analyze innateness today. And it's made them think really hard about, what it even means for something to be innate in this context.
Okay, so we've gone from, ancient theological views to Darwin and evolution, the rise and fall of instinct psychology, the ethology revival, and now we're talking about cognitive science in babies. It's clear this is a very complex and long-lasting debate.
It really is. And it's fascinating how this one question, nature versus nurture, keeps popping up in so many different areas of science.
So with all these different scientific angles on nativism, how have philosophers tried to make sense of it all? What are some of the frameworks they've come up with?
Well, philosophers have had some really insightful things to say about why this debate about nativism has been so persistent and why it cuts across so many different fields. One idea from Peter Godfrey Smith is that it might come down to differences in what he calls explanatory emphasis. He says that some explanations are what he calls externalist. They prioritize the influence of the environment. And then there are internalist explanations, which focus on things inside the organism, like genes or brain structures.
Okay, so focusing on different causes.
Right. And Godfrey Smith says that nativism is basically an internalist approach. So maybe the reason the debate keeps going is because different researchers are just focusing on different levels of explanation.
Okay, I see. But some philosophers think there's more to it than that. Right?
Yeah, Fiona Cowie, for example, she argues that this kind of explanation downplays some really genuine and important disagreements about what certain traits actually are, fundamentally.
Right, so it's not just about where people are choosing to focus their attention. There are deeper disagreements. What are some of the key things she points out?
Cowie argues that there are two main types of arguments that people use to defend nativism. First, you have the poverty of the stimulus arguments, like the one Chomsky made about language.
Right.
And second, you have what she calls impossibility arguments, which basically claim that certain traits must be innate because it's scientifically impossible for them to be learned.
Like the brain just couldn't possibly do it.
Right. And she says these two types of arguments point to two deeper debates going on. One is what she calls the special faculties debate, which is all about whether learning happens through these domain-specific mechanisms, like a language acquisition device, or through more general learning abilities.
So is there a special part of the brain just for learning language, or is it all part of a more general learning system?
Exactly. And then there's the mystery debate, which is kind of a deeper skepticism about whether certain aspects of development can even be explained scientifically at all.
Okay, so that's getting into some pretty philosophical territory.
Definitely. And while the mystery debate is sort of a more radical anti-empiricist view, the special faculties debate is still a big issue within psychology and cognitive science.
Right. So these debates are still very much alive in those fields.
Oh, yeah, for sure.
Now, Richard Samuels offers another philosophical angle, focusing on what he calls Psychological primitivism. What's that all about?
Samuels argues that for psychology, a belief or behavior is seen as innate if it's like a fundamental building block for explaining other psychological stuff, but that psychology itself can't explain that thing.
Okay.
So it's like a basic assumption you need to make sense of other things, but you don't go any deeper into explaining that assumption itself. He says that psychological explanations have to apply to the whole organism, whereas explanations in other fields like, say, neuroscience can focus on smaller parts, like neurons or brain regions.
Okay.
But some people have criticized this view, saying that it kind of creates this artificial wall between psychology and other sciences.
Right, like the brain is part of the organism, so why separate them?
Exactly. And to address some of those criticisms, Samuels adds that an innate psychological structure must also be something that would develop under normal conditions for that species. But defining what normal conditions means turns out to be surprisingly tricky.
Yeah, what does normal even mean in that context? It's not always so clear cut.
Right.
So this idea of a normal developmental environment keeps coming up as this like tricky issue. What are some other ways that philosophers have dealt with that?
Paul Griffiths has this idea called the clutter hypothesis, which builds on this observation by Patrick Bateson, who pointed out that, the word innate gets used in so many different ways.
Right, we've seen that throughout history.
Yeah. Griffiths argues that people often just assume that things labeled innate all belong together in this neat category, where being present at birth, being genetic, resisting environmental change, being an adaptation, all those things just go together.
Like they're all part of the same package deal.
Yeah. Right. But he says there's no single cause that guarantees all those features will always line up. He worked with Matteo Mameli, and they made this big list of these different properties of innateness, and they called them I properties. And their clutter hypothesis basically says that it's an open question, empirically, whether these I properties actually cluster together in any meaningful way. And we shouldn't just assume that they do, especially without knowing what the unifying cause would be.
So innate might not be a real unified thing, but just a bunch of loosely connected features.
Mm-hmm.
And maybe that explains why the debate's been so messy and confusing.
Exactly. If we think that, just because something is present at birth, it must also be genetic or resistant to environmental change, we could be making all sorts of wrong assumptions. And Griffiths also proposes this attractor hypothesis, which suggests that the reason we keep coming back to this idea of innateness is because it's tied to, like, our intuitive pre-scientific way of thinking about biology.
Okay, so like how we naturally think about living things even before we do any science.
Right. This is what's often called folk biology. And folk biology tends to assume that members of a species share some fundamental essence that determines their traits.
Right, like a blueprint.
Yeah, exactly. Griffiths says this kind of essentialist thinking actually influences scientific and philosophical judgments about innateness too, making the concept really hard to let go of even when it's causing problems.
So our intuitions about what's innate are kind of baked in, even if they don't always line up with the science.
Right. And there have been studies looking at how people intuitively understand innateness, and they found that things like, how fixed a trait is, how typical it is for the species, and what its function seems to be, those are all central to these judgments.
Okay.
And they've even found that these folk intuitions can influence how scientists themselves think about the concept.
Wow. That's kind of worrying if our everyday intuitions are like biasing the science.
It definitely raises some interesting questions about how objective we can be about these things.
So we've got these different philosophical perspectives that are, highlighting problems with how we frame the whole nature-nurture debate, problems with our assumptions about learning, with the boundaries between different scientific fields, with not having a clear definition of innate, and even problems with our basic intuitions about biology. It's a lot to take in. So, given all these challenges, what are philosophers saying about how we can move forward?
Well, there are two main strategies that philosophers have proposed. One is that we need to revise the concept of innate and make it more precise, more scientifically useful. And the other is that we should just get rid of it altogether, just stop using it in science.
So fix it or ditch it.
Pretty much, yeah. The revisionist approaches, they're all about trying to define innate more carefully by focusing on a specific subset of those I properties we talked about. The hope is that a more focused definition will lead to less confusion.
Okay, so let's talk about some of those revisions. What are some of the ways philosophers have tried to refine the concept of innate?
One common approach is to define it in terms of genetic specification or genetic information, like Lorenz did with his talk about, the calluses on ostriches. The basic idea is that traits that are typical for a species, that develop reliably, and that seem to be adaptations, well, those must be connected to our genes somehow.
Right, like they're in our DNA.
Exactly. But philosophers like Elliot Sober have really pushed back against this.
What do they say?
They point out that every single trait, no exceptions, needs both genes and an environment to develop. So asking how much is due to genes versus environment for a single trait, it just doesn't really make sense. And while quantitative genetics does look at genetic influences, it does that at the population level and in very specific environments. So it's hard to apply those findings to this idea of innateness as like a fixed characteristic of an individual.
Okay, so it's more complicated than just saying it's in the genes.
Way more complicated. And even Lorenz's idea of genes carrying information for traits, that's been challenged too. Genes mostly just code for protein structures, not directly for complex traits.
Right. And information isn't just a genetic thing. You can
Ah,
get information from the environment, too.
exactly.